How does a creature that has never seen its destination navigate 3,000 miles to a specific tree? This insect finds the exact branch used by its great-grandparents, bypassing the millions of other trees in the forest. In 1937, the zoology department in Toronto smelled of cedar and formaldehyde. Dr. Fred Urquhart sat at a wooden desk and stared at a map of North America while holding a monarch butterfly between his thumb and forefinger. The specimen weighed less than a penny. Urquhart knew this insect would vanish with the frost, but he had no idea where it went. For decades, the destination of these orange-winged travelers remained a total geographic void. Urquhart spent nearly 40 years obsessed with a mystery that defied the limits of biological memory. He and his wife Nora developed a tiny adhesive tag no larger than a fingernail to stick onto the wings of thousands of butterflies. They recruited an army of volunteers across the continent to catch, tag, and release the insects. This massive analog data collection effort began to yield results by the early 1970s. The tags were being recovered further and further south, leading toward the rugged mountains of central Mexico. The trail grew hot in the Sierra Madre, where the thin air carried a heavy scent of pine needles. On the 2nd of January 1975, two volunteer field trackers named Kenneth Brugger and Catalina Aguado climbed a steep ridge above the town of Angangueo. They reached 10,000 feet above sea level in near-freezing temperatures. When they stepped into a grove of oyamel fir trees, they stopped. Every square inch of bark was hidden. Millions of butterflies hung in thick, shivering clusters. The weight of the insects was so great that massive tree limbs bowed toward the forest floor. When the sun hit the canopy, the air turned into a shimmering cloud of orange. Fred Urquhart arrived at the site a year later, his boots crunching on the frozen ground of the Michoacan highlands. He searched the forest floor until he found a dead butterfly with a tiny white tag. A student in Minnesota had marked this specific insect over 2,000 miles away. This was the proof. However, the discovery only deepened the anomaly. These butterflies were the great-great-grandchildren of the ones that had left Mexico the previous spring. None of the individuals hanging from the oyamel branches had ever been to this forest before, yet they had found the exact same trees. A human pilot requires a cockpit full of instruments like altimeters, GPS, and gyroscopes to cross a continent. How does a brain the size of a pinhead execute a transcontinental flight path without a single error? The Monarch has a nervous system that shouldn't be capable of long-term data storage or complex spherical trigonometry. They fly against crosswinds that should blow them hundreds of miles off course. They navigate around mountain ranges and across the Great Lakes. They are not merely wandering south, they are being pulled by a force that science struggled to identify for nearly a century. Consider the energy requirements of a 3,000-mile journey. If a human were to scale this effort to their body size, it would be equivalent to a person running around the circumference of the Earth 14 times. The Monarch fuels this journey on nothing but nectar and stored fat. It is a biological machine optimized for a single, impossible task. Researchers began to look closer at the insect's anatomy, searching for a hidden compass in the eyes, the brain, and the thorax. They found nothing that explained the precision of the flight path. In the 1960s and 70s, Lincoln Brower from Amherst College began documenting the chemical ecology of these migrations. He discovered that the butterflies were sequestering toxins from milkweed to protect themselves from predators. But even Brower was baffled by the navigation. He noted that the migration wasn't just a behavior, it was a desperate biological necessity. If they missed the forest by even a few miles, they would freeze to death in the high-altitude nights. The margin for error was zero. The how remained buried in the insect's genome. The mystery took a turn toward the quantum in 1972. Wolfgang and Roswitha Wilczko published a paper in the journal Science demonstrating that migratory birds could sense the Earth's magnetic field. This wasn't a sense of smell or sight as we understand it, but something deeper. Biologists began to wonder if the Monarch possessed similar hardware. A bird's brain is massive compared to an insect's, and the search for a magnetic sensor in a creature with a microscopic brain seemed like a fool's errand. That changed when data started coming in from labs using advanced gene sequencing and neurobiology. This is not a story of instinct. It is a story of a biological anomaly that challenges our understanding of sensory perception. We are looking at a creature that perceives the planet in a way that is fundamentally alien to the human experience. The documents and expedition logs from the last 80 years tell a story of a silent orange tide that moves with the precision of a Swiss watch. But the clockwork isn't mechanical. It is something far more complex, hidden within the very cells of the butterfly's body. We will examine the specific biological hardware logged in a 2016 neurobiology study that proves these creatures possess a sensory capability humans can barely comprehend. This quantum-level navigation system is hidden in plain sight. This record is more than a study of a butterfly. It is an entry into the mechanics of the impossible. Every year, the sky fills with a riddle that refuses to be solved by traditional biology. The mechanism discovered in the antennae of these insects is currently rewriting the textbooks on animal perception, filed under Impossible, the Deep Index. Can a creature with a brain the size of a pinhead perform complex spherical geometry while battling crosswinds over the Appalachian Mountains? For decades, the consensus was that a monarch butterfly's 3,000-mile journey was a simple command written in its genetic code, a biological switch that flipped when the days grew short. In 1937, Fred Urquhart at the University of Toronto began a 40-year obsession to prove this. He developed a tiny adhesive wing tag no bigger than a fingernail and recruited thousands of volunteers to track these insects like orange-winged planes. The logic was that they were born with a destination pre-programmed in their cells. They were essentially winged robots, slaves to an ancestral map they couldn't deviate from. If the DNA said go to Mexico, they went to Mexico. Case closed. Nature rarely yields to simple answers. In a series of radical experiments, researchers decided to test the rigidity of this internal map. They captured hundreds of migrating monarchs in the Midwestern United States and physically transported them over 1,000 miles to the east, releasing them in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. According to the genetic map theory, the butterflies should have continued flying southwest as if they were still in Kansas. This would have led them straight into the Atlantic Ocean, a fatal error dictated by their DNA. The researchers waited, pens poised over weather-beaten notebooks, expecting to record a mass biological failure. The result was a total collapse of the prevailing theory. The butterflies did not fly southwest. Instead, they immediately pivoted. They adjusted their heading to the south-southeast, aiming directly toward the specific Oyamel fir forests in Michoacán, Mexico. They weren't just following a compass, they knew exactly where they were on the planet. This was active navigation. To pull this off, the Monarch needed to understand longitudinal displacement. This discovery sent shockwaves through the zoology departments of the 1970s. If the route wasn't just a genetic instinct, then the monarchs were using a sophisticated positioning system that science couldn't explain. At the University of Frankfurt, Wolfgang and Roswitha Wilczko were already finding similar anomalies in birds. In 1972, they proved that European robins possessed a magnetic sense, but it was incredibly fickle. If the light was too red or too dim, the birds lost their way. The map wasn't a static thing inside the animal, it was something they were actively pulling from the environment around them. The pilot was looking at something we couldn't see. Consider the sheer scale of the data processing required. A monarch weighs less than a gram. Its wings are essentially dried protein and scales. Yet, it can detect the subtle dip and curve of the Earth's magnetic field while simultaneously tracking the position of the sun. They do this on a sliding scale. Because the sun moves across the sky, the butterfly must constantly adjust its internal clock to ensure its heading remains true. This is time-compensated sun compass navigation. It requires a biological clock synchronized to the microsecond, linked to a visual system that never sleeps. The mystery deepened when researchers looked at the physical hardware. In the late 1960s, Lincoln Brower began investigating the chemical ecology of these migrations. He found that the butterflies were sequestering toxins from milkweed to stay alive, but he couldn't find the map in their nerves. There was no cluster of magnetite in the brain, no specialized GPS organ that stood out under a microscope. The butterflies were navigating with a ghost system. They were responding to forces that humans can only detect with multi-million-dollar satellite arrays and fluxgate magnetometers. In 1975, the search for the destination finally ended, but it only made the navigation problem more impossible. Kenneth Brugger and Catalina Aguado Trail climbed into the high-altitude mountains of central Mexico. The air was thin, smelling of damp earth and oyamel sap. They found millions of monarchs clinging to the trees in such density that the branches bowed under their weight. These were the great-great-grandchildren of the butterflies that had left months earlier. They had never been to these mountains. They had never seen these trees. Yet they had arrived at the exact same coordinates as their ancestors. If you take a human and drop them in the middle of a forest they have never visited, without a map or a phone, they will likely walk in circles. We lack the hardware to sense the planet's grid. But the Monarch treats the entire North American continent like a well-lit hallway. The Genetic Map Fallacy proved that the instructions aren't just fly south. The instructions are, go to these coordinates. This implies the butterfly has a way to perceive its own latitude and longitude in real time. It is a level of sensory input that borders on the supernatural. Every year the migration continues, and every year the data points to a missing link. We have identified the genes responsible for their wing muscles and their toxin resistance. We have mapped their flight paths with high-resolution telemetry. But the actual interface, the screen the pilot is looking at, remains blank to us. We are watching a master mariner navigate the globe with his eyes closed, and we cannot find his compass. The closer we look at the butterfly's brain, the less sense the journey makes. The genetic map is a lie. Instinct is too small a word for what is happening in the skies over the Serengeti or the forests of Mexico. The animals are not just following a feeling, they are reading a ledger written across the planet itself. But this realization led researchers to a terrifying question. If the butterfly is reading a map, where is the map actually located? When the sun went down and the magnetic fields shifted during a solar storm in 1989, the butterflies didn't just get lost. They reacted to something else entirely. The biological map is not a metaphor. It is a physical, visual overlay of the world that science has yet to capture on film. How can an insect navigate a 3,000-mile flight when its primary guide vanishes? For years, Lincoln Brower and his colleagues viewed the monarch butterfly as a solar navigator. The mathematics of the journey appeared elegant. If a creature knows the time of day and the sun's position, it possesses a compass. Scientists labeled this the time-compensated sun compass. It was a compelling theory because it relied on observable tools like eyes, light, and the sky's steady arc. However, in the deep oyamel fir forests, that logic failed. The sky often turns the color of wet slate as heavy clouds roll in from the Pacific, erasing the sun for days. Under these leaden skies, where a human would be hopelessly lost, the butterflies never slowed. They flew through the gray void as if the sun were still shining at high noon. Lincoln Brower spent decades watching these insects in the field, often shivering in the cold of the Michoacan highlands. He identified a glaring contradiction in the solar theory. When he placed monarchs in flight simulators under total overcast conditions, they did not fly in circles or drift. They maintained a southerly heading with terrifying precision. The monarch acted less like a pilot looking out a window and more like a pilot flying on instruments. But the biological blueprints of the butterfly showed no obvious magnets or specialized metallic hardware. The sun compass was supposed to be the primary engine, yet this engine ran perfectly even after the fuel was removed. In 1997, the mystery deepened when researchers manipulated the butterfly's sense of time. By shifting a monarch's internal clock by 6 hours using artificial lights and releasing it on a sunny day, the butterfly would miscalculate the sun's position and fly 90 degrees off course. This proved the sun compass existed. Yet the moment clouds moved in, the error vanished. The butterflies snapped back to the correct southern heading, ignoring their internal clock entirely. They possessed a backup system that only engaged when vision failed. This secondary system functioned independently of the time of day or light. It sensed something invisible that permeated the very air of the planet. This led a new generation of biologists to examine the monarch's anatomy, moving away from the brain and toward the extremities. They scrutinized the wings, the legs, and the tiny scales coating the body. They were looking for magnetite, the same iron-rich mineral found in the beaks of migratory birds and the snouts of salmon. In the late 20th century, the search for biological magnets became a scientific gold rush. If a butterfly had a grain of iron in its head, the mystery was solved, but the results were frustratingly inconsistent. Some labs found traces of iron while others found only background noise. The Monarch refused to reveal its hardware. It was a biological machine performing a feat of physics that the physical body did not seem to support. The search moved into the realm of the bizarre. Scientists wondered if the butterfly was sensing barometric pressure or the polarization of light, detecting the sun's position through thick clouds by reading how light waves scattered. But even polarized light has its limits, as it is lost in a thick fog. Still, the monarchs kept moving. The University of Toronto's Fred Urquhart spent his life tagging these insects and watching them disappear into the horizon. He knew their survival depended on a precision that defied simple biology. A 1-degree error over 3,000 miles means missing the overwintering forest by 50 miles. In the mountains of Mexico, 50 miles in the wrong direction is a death sentence. By the early 2000s, the focus shifted to the antennae. For a century, entomologists believed these stalks were merely for smell, detecting mates or the scent of milkweed. But when researchers began surgically removing or painting the antennae of migrating monarchs, the results were catastrophic. Without them, the butterflies could still fly and see the sun, but they lost their sense of direction entirely. They became drifters. This provided the first concrete evidence that the butterfly's GPS was not located in the brain. The navigational computer was sitting on top of the head, waving in the wind. This discovery created a new problem. If the antennae were the compass, how did they communicate with the eyes? Furthermore, how did they function in total darkness or heavy cloud cover? Researchers at the University of Massachusetts Medical School began to poke at the genetic level, looking for proteins that reacted to the Earth's magnetic field. They were looking for a needle in a haystack of DNA. Specifically, they sought a protein called a cryptochrome that reacts to blue light. But monarchs do not just migrate in blue light. They travel through the golden hues of autumn and the gray shadows of storms. The pieces of the puzzle were on the table, but they did not form a recognizable image. The sheer scale of the migration makes the mystery urgent. Every year, a new generation of monarchs insects that have never been to Mexico take flight from southern Canada. They are the Methuselah generation, living 8 times longer than their parents to complete this one-way trip. They do not follow a leader or a trail of scent. They are born with a map, a clock, and a compass all integrated into a body that weighs less than a paperclip. As the 1970s expeditions of Kenneth Brugger and Catalina Aguado proved, they all end up in the same few acres of forest. Millions of bodies drape over the same branches year after year, with the regularity of a heartbeat. We are left with a creature that defies the standard laws of sensory biology. It does not just see the world, it feels the world in a way that humans cannot even simulate without complex electronics. The sun compass theory was a comfortable answer because it fit within our understanding of vision. But the sun clock failure forces us to look for a sense that should not exist in an insect. It suggests the monarch is plugged into the planet itself, reading a signal that is constant, invisible, and ancient. The question shifted from how they see the sun to what they are seeing when the sun is gone. The answer arrived not through a microscope, but through a radical reimagining of how biology interacts with the forces of the Earth. If the butterfly was not using iron or the sun, it had to be using the magnetosphere. Sensing a magnetic field requires a level of sensitivity that seemed impossible for a nervous system as simple as a butterfly's. To find the truth, Scientists had to stop looking at the butterfly as a collection of cells and start looking at it as a quantum observer. What they found in the antennae was not just a sensor, it was a window into a hidden layer of reality.
Why did the monarch butterfly continue its flight when the sun vanished? For years, Lincoln Brower and his fellow researchers viewed the 3,000-mile journey as a feat of solar navigation. The math appeared elegant until it broke against a wall of clouds. In the late 1990s, the scientific community realized these insects could maintain a perfect heading even under a complete ceiling of gray. If the sun served as their only compass, a single stormy week in Kansas should have sent the entire migration spiraling into the Atlantic. It didn't. They kept flying south-southwest with the precision of a guided missile, suggesting a secondary system that functioned without photons. By 1997, biologists began to suspect the butterflies were sensing the Earth's magnetic field. Magnetoreception was already a documented phenomenon in larger travelers. In 1972, Wolfgang and Roswitha Wilczko proved that European robins possessed an internal compass, demonstrating that birds could feel the magnetic tug of the poles. This feat was later observed in sea turtles and salmon. But while a bird has a brain the size of a marble, a monarch butterfly's entire nervous system is smaller than a pinhead. The idea that an invertebrate could house a biological sensor capable of detecting a field thousands of times weaker than a refrigerator magnet seemed impossible. To test this, researchers placed monarchs inside a flight simulator surrounded by a Helmholtz coil. When the current was flipped to reverse the poles, the butterflies instantly turned 180 degrees. They weren't looking at the light, but were instead feeling the Earth. The data was undeniable, yet it created a massive anatomical crisis. Where was the sensor? In most animals suspected of having this sixth sense, scientists looked for magnetite, which are tiny, iron-rich crystals that act like microscopic compass needles. They searched the butterfly's thorax and dissected the abdomen, looking for iron deposits that might twitch or pull when the magnetic field shifted. They found nothing. There were no magnetic rocks hidden in their tissues. It was as if the butterflies were tuned into a radio frequency without possessing an antenna. The search for a physical magnet was failing because the biology was far more radical than a simple piece of iron. In 2014, the investigation shifted toward the butterfly's head. Stephen Reppert and his team at the University of Massachusetts Medical School began to look at the brain, specifically the circadian clock neurons. They knew the butterflies needed to integrate time and space to navigate. If you traveled for weeks, the sun's position in the sky changed, and the butterfly adjusted its flight path accordingly. But the magnetic sense worked independently of this clock as a constant, underlying grid. The team began to suspect that the butterfly wasn't just feeling the field, but was processing it as a form of data that required a specific gateway. They looked at the brain's central complex, the command center for flight, but the wiring there didn't show any direct connection to a magnetic input. The mystery deepened when researchers noticed a strange behavior during the Helmholtz coil experiments. The butterflies could only use their magnetic compass if they were exposed to a very specific wavelength of light. In total darkness, the magnetic sense vanished. This discovery stunned the University of Massachusetts team because a magnetic field doesn't need light to exist. A compass works in a cave just as well as it works in a meadow. If the butterfly's compass required light to function, the mechanism wasn't mechanical or mineral. It was photochemical. The insect wasn't using a needle, but was instead using a chemical reaction triggered by the environment. This led the team to a protein called cryptochrome. Found in the eyes of many species, cryptochromes are sensitive to blue light and are known to regulate biological rhythms. But in monarchs, these proteins were different. Stephen Reppert's team discovered that monarchs possess two types of cryptochromes, one of which is vertebrate-like. When they took the monarch's version of this protein and placed it into fruit flies that had been genetically stripped of their own compass, the fruit flies suddenly regained the ability to navigate via magnetic fields. The protein worked. The ghost had a name, but identifying the protein only made the biological reality more unsettling. If the compass was light-dependent and protein-based, the butterfly wasn't merely feeling a tug toward Mexico. The prevailing theory shifted towards something much more cinematic, where the magnetic field was likely being translated into a visual overlay. Imagine a pilot's heads-up display, where navigation lines are projected directly onto the windshield. Scientists proposed that the chemical reaction within the cryptochromes created a shading effect in the butterfly's field of vision. To a monarch, the north might look darker, or the south might appear as a faint, glowing patch of blue. They weren't following a map. They were flying toward a color that only they could see. However, even this breakthrough hit a snag. For the cryptochromes in the eyes to function as a compass, the butterfly's head would need to remain perfectly level and stable at all times to keep the display calibrated. But butterflies don't fly level. They bob, weave, and tilt their heads constantly as they battle wind currents. A visual compass in the eyes would be spinning and flickering like a broken television screen. The math for a stabilized visual compass in the eye didn't hold up under the chaotic reality of a transcontinental flight. The sensor had to be somewhere else, shielded from the frantic movement of the head, yet still exposed to the light. The search moved to the most obvious, yet most overlooked part of the insect, the antennae. For a century, the antennae were dismissed as simple odor detectors used for smelling milkweed and finding mates. But when researchers began to look at the gene expression within these thin, clubbed stalks, they found something that didn't belong. The antennae were packed with the same clock genes and cryptochromes found in the brain and eyes. Even more shocking, when researchers painted the antennae of migrating monarchs with black paint to block the light, the butterflies lost their way entirely. Their eyes were wide open and the sun was shining, yet they were blind to their destination. The implications were staggering. The butterfly's entire navigation suite, the GPS, the clock, and the magnetic sensor, wasn't housed in the brain at all. It was located in the two thin filaments waving in the wind. But this discovery raised a final, terrifying question for the team at the University of Massachusetts. If the antennae were the primary sensors, how did they transmit such complex, multi-layered data to a brain the size of a grain of sugar? The connection wasn't just biological. It appeared to be operating at a level of physics that shouldn't exist in a living creature. The deeper they looked into the antennae, the more the biology began to resemble a quantum computer. What the index concludes: the monarch butterfly does not just fly south. It navigates via a light-activated quantum sensor that renders the Earth.
Why would a researcher paint a butterfly's antennae with surgical ink? In 2009, inside a laboratory at the University of Massachusetts Medical School, Dr. Stephen Reppert and his team began a study of the monarch butterfly. This creature weighs less than a paperclip, yet it possesses the navigational stamina of a transcontinental jet. For years, the scientific community believed the butterfly's brain was the sole seat of its genius, assuming the brain processed the sun's position to calculate a heading. But when the team coated those two flickering stalks in black ink, the biological compass shattered. The butterflies flew in erratic, desperate circles. They were blind, but not in their eyes. Sunlight poured into the flight simulator. The butterflies could see the horizon, the sky, and the golden glow of the afternoon, yet they were hopelessly lost. The team then tried a second group, coating the antennae in clear enamel. These butterflies flew straight, locking onto the southwest path toward Mexico with surgical precision. This moment shifted the paradigm. Because the clear coating allowed light to pass through while the black ink blocked it, the team realized the antennae weren't just feeling the wind or smelling milkweed. They were seeing. They were detecting the sun's cycles independently of the eyes. The brain was no longer the captain of the ship, it was merely a passenger. A butterfly antenna is a masterpiece of microengineering. Under a microscope, it reveals a landscape of thousands of sensory pits and microscopic hairs. These are not static sticks, but high-tech flight computers. Before Reppert's 2009 study, entomologists treated antennae as simple olfactory organs used for smelling mates or food. However, the ink experiment proved they contained their own circadian clocks. They possessed the molecular machinery to track the sun's movement across the sky, calibrated to the exact millisecond. If you removed the antennae, the butterfly's internal clock remained in its brain, but the navigation system failed. The two systems had to talk to each other, but the antennae held the map. Consider the physical reality of a monarch in flight. It is buffeted by gale-force winds and soaked by rain. It dodges predators and navigates through the smog of industrial corridors. To maintain a heading of 215 degrees toward a specific mountain range in Michoacán, the insect needs a constant stream of data. Reppert's team discovered that the antennae were providing a time-compensated sun compass. As the sun moves from east to west, the antennae adjust the butterfly's flight angle automatically. It is a living algorithm. The smell of the lab, the sterile click of the timers, and the sight of these inked insects struggling to find north confirmed that we had been looking at the wrong organ for a century. But the discovery raised a new, more unsettling problem. In the fall of 2011, researchers took the experiment further by testing the butterflies under heavy cloud cover. Even when the sun was completely obscured by thick blankets of Atlantic moisture, the monarchs didn't lose their way. If the antennae were solar sensors, they should have been useless in the dark or under a storm. Yet, the migration continued. The butterflies maintained their heading as if they were looking at a clear sky. The ink had blocked the light, but something else was guiding them through the clouds. Something invisible. Something that didn't rely on the sun at all. This led the team to look deeper into the protein structure of the antennae. They weren't just looking for light sensors anymore. They were looking for a ghost in the machine. They began to investigate the role of cryptochromes, which are specialized proteins sensitive to blue light. In many animals, these proteins regulate sleep, but in the monarch, they seem to be doing something far more radical. The researchers found that these proteins were clustered in the very tips of the antennae. When they sequenced the genome, they found a specific type of cryptochrome that looked remarkably similar to the ones found in migratory birds. The implications were staggering. In the 1970s, Wolfgang and Roswitha Wilczko had proven that birds could sense the Earth's magnetic field. They called it a magnetic compass. Birds have massive brains and complex nervous systems, so the idea that an insect with a brain the size of a grain of sand could possess the same planetary scale sensing equipment was dismissed as biological fantasy. Yet, the data from the University of Massachusetts was undeniable. When the light-based solar compass in the antennae was silenced or obscured, the butterfly didn't stop. It switched to a backup system that functioned like a silent, invisible tether to the planet itself. The team noticed a strange behavior during the experiments. If they changed the magnetic field around the flight enclosure using large copper coils, The butterflies would shift their orientation even if the sun was visible. The magnetic pull was overriding the visual data. This suggested that the antennae were not just solar clocks, but multimodal sensors. They were pulling in the angle of the sun, the polarization of light, and the magnetic pull of the poles all at once. The butterfly wasn't just flying. It was submerged in a sea of data that humans are completely blind to. If the antennae were the receivers, the scientists had to ask how the signal reached the wings. They tracked the neural pathways from the base of the antennae to the central complex of the brain. They found a direct line of communication, a high-speed data bus that bypassed the higher-order processing centers. The navigation was reflexive and hardwired. But as they mapped these nerves, they realized the mystery hadn't been solved, but had only been pushed deeper. Sensing a magnetic field is one thing, but how does a biological tissue made of soft cells and water detect a force as weak as the Earth's magnetism? The answer seemed to point toward a specific chemical reaction occurring within the antennae, something so fast and so small it defied classical biology. They were looking for a needle in a haystack of molecules. In 2014, the search narrowed to a single protein that reacted to magnetic fields in a way that seemed to violate the laws of standard chemistry. It wasn't just a sensor, it was a window into a different type of physics. The butterflies weren't just following a map, they were seeing a force that shouldn't be visible. And if they could see the magnetic field, what did the world actually look like to them? What the index concludes: the monarch butterfly does not navigate by instinct alone, but through a specialized pair of antennal flight computers that process solar and magnetic data independently of the brain. Does a monarch butterfly see a world that remains invisible to the human eye? These insects perceive a layer of reality we can only detect using high-altitude magnetometers and specialized sensors. Scientists long suspected these creatures possessed an internal compass, perhaps utilizing tiny iron crystals in their tissues, similar to those found in homing pigeons. When researchers searched for those crystals, they found nothing. The hardware was missing. This forced the 1962 investigation to shift from the what to the how, eventually leading to a discovery that broke the traditional understanding of biological navigation. The secret was not magnetism pulling on a physical needle, but the behavior of light acting upon a blue reactive protein called cryptochrome. In the late 1990s, the study of these proteins moved from botany into animal behavior. Cryptochromes were first identified in plants, where they regulated growth toward light sources. When molecular biologists sequenced the monarch genome, they found something startling. The butterfly possessed two types of cryptochrome rather than one. The first was a standard version used to set an internal clock. The second, Cry2, was a vertebrate-like protein that defied simple mechanical explanation. This sensor responded to the blue end of the light spectrum, yet it did more than signal the presence of the sun. It appeared to trigger a chemical reaction sensitive to the Earth's magnetic field. Researchers eventually realized this was not a sense of touch or direction, but a sense of sight. Imagine a pilot flying through thick fog without a horizon or a view of the ground. Usually, that pilot would rely on a dashboard of glowing gauges. The monarch has no dashboard. Instead, theory suggests the butterfly sees the magnetic field as a visual overlay, a shifting gradient of light and shadow superimposed over the physical world. Where we see a green forest, the monarch might see a shimmering blue veil that fluctuates in density as it turns its head toward the planetary poles. Biology here enters the realm of the impossible. For a protein to react to a magnetic field as weak as the Earth's, the reaction must occur at a subatomic level. This is quantum biology. When a photon of blue light hits the cryptochrome in the monarch's eye, it kicks an electron from one molecule to another to create a pair of radical ions. Because of a quantum property called spin, these molecules become momentarily sensitive to magnetic forces. The Earth's field is just strong enough to tilt the outcome of this chemical reaction. The brain receives this signal not as a feeling, but as a pixel of data in the butterfly's field of vision. The implications were staggering. Navigation was not a separate sixth sense tucked away in a corner of the brain, but a fundamental part of how the insect experienced the world. By 2009, Stephen Reppert's team at the University of Massachusetts Medical School had proven the antennae were the key to the sun compass. However, data from the 2000s showed a glaring inconsistency. Butterflies lost their way when their antennae were obstructed, even though the magnetic sense was supposed to be in the eyes. These two systems appeared to be housed in different parts of the body, while working in perfect synchronization. A dark twist emerged when researchers tested monarchs in zero-field environments where copper coils neutralized the Earth's magnetic pull. In these chambers, the butterflies became erratic. They had plenty of light and functioning internal clocks, yet they flew in circles as if they had been blinded. This proved the magnetic sense was mandatory. When the experiment moved to a red light frequency, the quantum reaction in the cryptochromes failed to trigger. The butterflies were effectively magnetically blind in a red room, even though they could still see physical objects. The mystery deepened when scientists examined the antennae themselves. These thin stalks were not just receptors for smell or wind speed, as they were packed with the same cryptochrome proteins found in the eyes. This redundancy seemed to make no sense. The team eventually realized the antennae were the primary processors, the hardware allowing the monarch to calibrate its sun compass against the magnetic field. Without the antennae, the visual data from the eyes was useless noise. By 2014, the prevailing theory defined the monarch as a living drone using a multimodal sensor suite to stay on course. It used the sun for a primary heading, an internal clock to adjust for time, and a magnetic sense as a true north backup. A massive problem remained because the magnetic field of the Earth is not a straight line. It curves, dips, and fluctuates due to iron deposits in the crust. If the monarch followed a simple magnetic map, it would get lost over every magnetic anomaly, yet it never did. The University of Massachusetts researchers investigated the molecular structure of the Cry2 protein and found it almost identical to proteins in the human eye. It featured a crucial modification that allowed it to sustain a quantum state for a few microseconds longer. Those microseconds provided the difference between a random chemical flicker and a navigational signal. The butterfly was performing a constant subatomic calculation that filtered out crustal noise to find the signal of the planetary core. Observations from the field in Michoacan then threw the theory into chaos. While the quantum compass explained the journey to Mexico, it did not explain the final mile. The magnetic field can guide a traveler to a mountain range, but it cannot point to a single tree among millions. It cannot explain why a butterfly, born 3 generations after its ancestors left that forest, would land on the exact same branch. The quantum vision was the map, but it was not the destination. A final, hidden signal remained. If the eyes see the field and the antennae process the time, what recognizes home in a place the traveler has never been? The index files this entry under biological quantum sensing. We have confirmed the presence of cryptochrome proteins and documented the failure of navigation in zero-field conditions. We have measured the subatomic shifts that allow a half-gram insect to perceive the planetary core, but the archive remains open on the final mechanism of arrival. The Monarch software is more than a compass. It is a memory inherited without a brain to store it. As the search moved to the very tips of the antennae, the team found a final, microscopic structure that did not belong. It was not a sensor for light, and it was not a sensor for magnetism. What the index concludes: the monarch butterfly utilizes a quantum-level visual overlay to navigate the planet, but this vision is only the secondary layer of a guidance system located in a structure science is only beginning to map. Could a protein called Cry4 be the reason a creature with a brain the size of a pinhead can navigate across a continent? For decades, Fred Urquhart and the zoology department at the University of Toronto stared at these insects and saw a biological impossibility. They watched the monarch fly toward a specific tree it had never seen before, searching for an answer that wasn't written in genes or a simple reaction to the sun. The truth is far more profound. The The Monarch butterfly navigates using a biological quantum compass located in its antennae. This literal sensory overlay of the Earth's magnetic pull is rendered into the butterfly's field of vision by a mechanism operating at the subatomic level. In 2016, a landmark neurobiology study finally cracked the casing on this internal hardware. Scientists had long suspected the brain was the seat of navigation, but the data pointed elsewhere. When researchers looked at the antennae under high-resolution equipment, they found Cry4. This protein belongs to a class called cryptochromes. In the presence of blue light, Cry4 triggers a chemical reaction that creates a pair of radicals. These are molecules with an odd number of electrons that are quantum entangled. These radicals are hypersensitive to the angle and strength of the Earth's magnetic field. As the butterfly flies, the shifting magnetic pull changes the chemical state of these proteins. This signal is sent directly to the nervous system. It likely appears to the butterfly as a gradient of light or a dark patch, a visual guidepost that points the way to Mexico even in total darkness or heavy cloud cover. Think back to 1,937 inches Toronto. Fred Urquhart was hunched over a desk, trying to figure out how to track a creature that weighs less than a gram. He spent years developing adhesive tags, tiny white stickers that wouldn't weigh the wings down. He recruited thousands of volunteers to act as his eyes across North America. He was looking for a destination, a physical place on a map, but he was also looking for the how. He wanted to know what kind of internal clock could possibly guide a fourth-generation butterfly to a forest in the Michoacán mountains that its parents and grandparents had never visited. The answer he sought wasn't a landmark, it was a quantum sensor. The Monarch is reading the fundamental forces of the planet. The discovery of the antenna-based compass changed everything we thought we knew about insect biology. In 2009, at the University of Massachusetts Medical School, the team led by Stephen Reppert proved that if you remove the antennae, the butterfly loses its way entirely. This occurred even when the sun was shining brightly. The brain handles the processing, but the sensors are external. The antennae are two vibrating, sensitive stalks that act as high-altitude magnetometers. They provide a constant stream of data, a live feed of the Earth's magnetic contours. This allows the Monarch to maintain a straight line over thousands of miles of open water and shifting terrain, ignoring the distractions of wind and weather. This biological hardware is ancient, yet it outperforms the most sophisticated human-made GPS systems in terms of efficiency. A Monarch butterfly requires no satellites, no battery, and no external signal processing. It generates its own navigation data from the very air it breathes and the magnetic field that surrounds us all. While humans rely on glass screens and silicon chips to find their way home, the Monarch uses a single protein and the laws of quantum mechanics. It is a level of technological integration that we are only just beginning to replicate in laboratories. The butterfly is a living, flying, quantum computer. When Kenneth Brugger and Catalina Aguado finally stood in the Oyamel fir forests in 1975, they were surrounded by millions of orange wings. The sound was like a soft rain, the collective shivering of millions of insects trying to stay warm at 10,000 feet. They had found the destination Urquhart had dreamed of for 40 years. They were also standing in the middle of a massive biological broadcast. Each of those butterflies had arrived there by seeing the magnetic lines of the Earth. The forest wasn't just a place to sleep, it was the final coordinate in a 3,000-mile quantum calculation. The precision of their arrival on those specific branches is a testament to the reliability of the Cry4 protein. This sensory capability is something humans can barely comprehend. We perceive the world through 5 basic senses, but the Monarch lives in a reality where the Earth's magnetism is a visible, tactile thing. It is a 6th sense that is always on and always calibrated. The 2016 neurobiology findings suggest that this capability might be more common in the animal kingdom than we ever realized. In the Monarch, it has reached a peak of perfection. The butterfly's journey is a yearly reminder that there are layers of reality functioning right in front of us that we are completely blind to. We see a bug, The bug sees the magnetic skeleton of the world. The implications for our own technology are staggering. If we can truly understand how a biological system maintains quantum entanglement in a warm, wet environment like a living cell, it could revolutionize how we build sensors. Current quantum computers require near absolute zero temperatures to function. The Monarch butterfly does it at 70 degrees Fahrenheit while flapping its wings. We are looking at a masterclass in engineering that is millions of years old. The specific biological hardware logged in that 2016 study is not just an entry in a textbook, it is a blueprint for the future of navigation. What the index concludes: the Monarch butterfly navigates using a biological quantum compass located in its antennae. This mechanism allows the insect to visualize the Earth's magnetic field as a persistent navigational overlay. It proves that complex quantum processes are not restricted to the laboratory, but are a fundamental requirement for one of the greatest migrations on Earth. The record remains open as we investigate other species that may share this hidden site. The journey of the Monarch is a reminder that the smallest creatures often possess the most advanced technology. Subscribe a new breakdown like this every day.